Welcome back to the Bigfoot Manifesto, where progressive politics, cryptid metaphors, and a little campfire chaos collide. Today, we're talking dangerous stories. Putin spins Nazis in Ukraine, Trump yells rigged elections, Facebook feeds us QAnon Kool-Aid. And to help us unpack how myths become weapons, I'm talking with Andrea Chalupa, journalist, historian, and co-host of the wonderful Gaslit Nation podcast. So welcome to the Bigfoot Manifesto, Andrea Chalupa. Glad to have you. I consider you a friend now since you've had me on your podcast for Americon. I always enjoy talking to you. And I always consider you what I call a foxhole comrade, the person you want in a foxhole with you. You know, you got to be careful with like the moderates. You don't know which are going to flow, but you're someone you want in a foxhole.
Damn right. Honored to be here. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for being here. So, let's jump right into it. We're talking, this is our Bigfoot versus the Strongman, our Putin and authoritarianism episode. And, the first question I have for you is on numerous times you've called, disinformation one of Putin's sharpest weapons. What makes it so effective for him?
Because people are idiots and they're generally emotionally led. And even people who are highly educated, I mean, most of the villains are up against, like Ted Cruz, they've gone to Ivy League schools, the best education, supposedly, that money can buy. And so what he's doing is the Russians have spent about an estimate like $1 billion collectively on turning their entire media landscape in Russia into what one Russian described to me as Fox News on acid. And they've banned a free press in the country, certainly since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But in addition to that, they have bot farms, including set up in Africa, to throw money at extremely poor, vulnerable people to pose as white Christian moms in Ohio with MAGA in their bio. And in the early years of these bot farms, I remember the bots were very try to pose as very scary. Like they'd have a flaming skull as an avatar, and they'd call me like a Jewish fascist whore. Very sort of like the early generation of the Russian bots were like early generation computers, just like bulky and awkward. And then then you can see a transformation where they were suddenly all having American flags and they're all white women in the Midwest but still writing in broken English. And now they're basically in the White House and they're getting busted in these DOJ investigations for taking hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like Tim, what's that guy's name? Tim Cast and Benny, oh gosh, their names escape me, but you know who I'm talking about, like those MAGA influencers in that big DOJ investigation. I'll send you an article on it so you can link to it in the show notes so people can read about it there. But so the reason why disinformation propaganda works so well is because when you're bombarded with it, you are just the good faith actor in you that wants to see the story from all sides is left reeling and thinking, I don't know what to believe.
Yeah.
And you also get bullied on top of that, you get bullied into silence. So it's like they hit you on all sides. So on one side, they have their Kremlin bots harassing you online, trying to intimidate you to back down. Anytime you post an article that's truthful or share an opinion based on fact, they'll bombard you, harass you. Gamergate was an early experiment in this. Pizzagate was the Russians were flaring up on Pizzagate. And then QAnon, of course, that was invented by the far right to protect the pedophile in the White House from Jeffrey Epstein investigations and so on. And of course, our own homegrown fascists are part of this as well. But what the Russians do is they put so many resources into amplifying what our idiots here at home are already doing. And so that's how they commingle over time to create this perfect storm. And on top of that, you have increasing oligarch ownership in the United States. Jeff Bezos, Washington Post, and so on and so on. And now CBS under the Ellison family, that's conservative, and they just installed Barry Weiss as their thought police. and she's basically like a highbrow version of Charlie Kirk. So yes, it's a perfect storm right now of imprisoning the American mind in a propaganda empire, and its reach is global. And they're trying to drag down every democracy that's still clinging to the rule of law and regulations, including regulations of big corporate America, with it.
Well, I was going through some numbers, like, because I was looking at like what's happening inside Russia, and how the propaganda works on their people. Like, first of all, like you said, I think the stat I got is like, I think Russia Today and Sputnik like are in like over 100 countries right now. So, I mean, that's a wide reach. But I saw a Kremlin poll. So I don't know how, but it said like 80% of the Russian people believe the denazification, excuse or cause belli, I guess, to invade Ukraine. Like 80% believe that denazification lie. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's a Kremlin poll I saw. So I mean, I don't know how to get other data on that. But do you know anything on or numbers on how the Russian people are feeling about this? Do you get any info there?
It's hard to tell because the polling itself is flawed because people are too afraid to give their actual opinions because they don't know how that information can be used against them. Imagine being inside Russia where your opposition leaders have been murdered over the years, journalists
Yeah.
imprisoned, all independent media shut down. One big story that's been circulating a lot lately in the American press ever since Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert, Colbert was canceled by CBS for this Ellison merger, and then Jimmy Kimmel was taken off for a week over just pointing out what needed to be said about Charlie Kirk's murder and, and so on. So the big story circulating was Americans were learning that when Putin was coming up, there was a hugely popular comedy show with puppets that like half the country watched every Sunday, making fun of everyone in power, especially Putin. And one of the first things he did was he ensured media ownership, media consolidation by his loyalists. And then, of course, that comedy show disappeared. And so over time, there's just been this reign of terror in the information space in Russia, where people have become extremely good at self-censoring themselves and not even, and just sort of, so what dictatorship does is it forces you out of public life. It forces you out of the political arena where you feel you have a right to say, I want to have a say in who governs me and how. It forces you to become apolitical and see even having a political opinion as something that's dangerous or useless. And so you become impotent politically, And
Yeah.
so it's hard to tell what the Russians think, but we do know for a fact that, like every dictator, Putin depends on a base of support. And the base of support within Russia is quite sizable. We know that because, or else we'd have a revolution in the streets like we've had in Ukraine, like we've had relentless protests in Georgia, the country of Georgia, that's been taken over by their own Russian-backed oligarchs. And so we don't have that widespread uprising, and we never have with the Russian people. And part of it is because historically, the Russians have benefited from imperialism. They've been fed this idea of Russian chauvinism, Russian imperialism, might makes right. And people have to remember the Soviet Union itself was a gaslighting term. The Soviet Union was another word for the Russian Empire. And you know that
Correct.
for a fact because the countries occupied by the Soviet Union, they lost their language, their leading thinkers, their intellectuals were mass arrested, driven to commit suicide, disappeared. And what language replaced their mother tongue? Russian. Textbooks, leading thinkers all became Russian. And so during the entire Iron Curtain, you had uprisings in 1956, the Hungarian uprising. And the reaction to that, of these college kids, of these workers, of these unions rising up, not only in Hungary in 1956, but in Poland and elsewhere, and saying, like, we demand a European future, and democracy reforms, anti-corruption reforms. What happened in reaction to that? Moscow sent 1,000 tanks into Hungary to brutally suppress that uprising. I just met with a Polish woman who remembered being a little girl and watching the tanks roll in across the Russian border and on their way to Hungary. So yes, so that Russian imperial mindset is really what has poisoned the Russian people for centuries, because we've had a Russian empire for centuries, and they feel entitled to Ukraine. They feel entitled to raping, pillaging Ukraine. They feel that's theirs. And the reason why the MAGA movement, Donald Trump, has been so aligned with the Russians is because they share the same values of might makes right.
I think we're going to touch on in the next segment that we're going to talk about, because I'm going to talk about from the American side and how it's affected us. The one thing I was just thinking, I was kind of laughing about too, but when when the denazification of cause belli was there, and I was like, yeah, but Zelensky's a Jew. I was like, can you, that's the best you can do? Denazification? I was like, you kidding me? And, let's not go into, the anti-Semitism that was rife through the Russian Empire,
Well, that's the thing is
Yeah.
so the Russian state propaganda tells the Russian people Zelensky is a Jew who's being used by American Zionism. So basically they're leveraging the anti-Semitic feeling among Russians that's historically been there, the pogroms by the Russian Empire going back centuries against Zelensky. And then they tell outside audiences through Sputnik, through their bot farms, that Zelensky is a Nazi, because Ukraine has had its own dark chapters of collaborating with the Nazis, like so many countries during World War II. So it's like they do both narratives, but for different audiences.
Yeah, and it's, and you look for the Russian people, it's just difficult for dissent. You're getting, you go into the gulag, and thinking about that, I was like, all these guys falling off of balconies. And I was joking with a Russian friend, and I was talking about the podcast, and I said, well, at least chasing Bigfoot doesn't get people killed. He said, so I'm like, I'm going to work with Bigfoot. I'm like, not so much Putin. But, there's not much options for them. It's like, it's getting hard to get out of there. And look at them, you end up poisoned or pushed off a balcony. It's just horrible. I mean, I just don't know where it ends in this war. What are we, 3.5 years in now? Is it 3.5, Andrea?
Yeah, well, the war itself started in spring of, it started in March of 2014 when Russia seized Crimea.
Correct.
And then they launched the full-scale invasion in February 2022, and it's just been a massive crisis, genocide ever since then. And the biggest tragedy is, you talk about the Epstein files, the biggest tragedy of Russia's invasion, genocide against Ukraine is that they've kidnapped so many children. When they occupy a Ukrainian city, they kidnap the children, they send them into Russia and force them to learn Russian. If they're old enough, they'll force them into the army to fight against Ukraine. And a lot of those kids, we don't know what's happened to them. And there are efforts, including at Yale University, to trace and track down as many children as possible just to find out where they are in the hopes of getting them back one day. But mark my words, we've seen how ferociously Ukrainians have been fighting. I mean, Biden's administration said to Zelensky, like, we'll give you a ride. Let's get you out of there. And he's like, I don't need a ride. I need ammo. And then he did that selfie video saying, we're all here. We're still here. And so what's going to happen, and it's already happening, is you're going to basically have the Ukrainian version of Nazi hunters to hunt down these Russian war criminals for the rest of their lives until they're all accounted for.
Yeah, and it's the thing with the children being abducted. Like, I've been following that too, and like, you haven't seen anything like on a state kind of scale of that since like the Ottomans, would do it. That's how they filled their janissaries, and their grand vizier was usually not a Turk. It was usually someone, a child they abducted and groomed. To say. So yeah, I mean, it's just a sad mess there, and it's really sad to see. And I mean, I just don't know where it ends. I mean,
well,
at some
Putin's
point,
gonna die eventually.
Yeah.
I mean, he's probably in denial about that, but Putin's gonna die. Trump will eventually die. It doesn't mean the problems for the world are over.
Yeah.
It just means that what happens is time catches up to them and movements catch up to them. And eventually, when you hit rock bottom as a society, you have new generations rising who are looking at how others are living and thinking like, why can't we live that way? And they eventually force reforms. I think America is going to get there far sooner than Russia because we're used to a certain customer service in our society. We're used to a certain
Correct.
amount of
Yeah.
agency in our society. The Russians never had democracy. They never had democracy. The 90s were chaos,
Yeah.
mass poverty, and a lot of Westerners who went over there like it was a gold rush, like dancing a victory jig on the ashes of the Soviet Union and just grabbing whatever money and young girls they could in like the sudden crash course in hypercapitalism. So the 90s were a very dark period in Russia, and then the answer to that after drunken Yeltsin was hardline Putin. So they've never
Food. Yeah.
ever experienced democracy or a celebration of multiculturalism other than if that multiculturalism was a celebration ultimately of Russian empire.
Yeah, and I mean, if you know Russian history, it's just like, as we said earlier, it's 700 years of that, from the Mongols to the Rush. I mean, you can go down the line. It's like it's like one dictator after another, basically. I mean, that's all they know. That was the other thing I think that also surprised a lot of Marxist and communist. It was, they always said that was the last place that would have a revolution, and it was the first place that had a communist revolution.
Well, it's because the Tsar's family was so far right. They were brutal during a time of global pandemic, during the Great War with mass casualties. And so the people were just so abused by the Tsar's family. They had no choice. But you also had a Russian Revolution that was fermented by independence movements, including in Ukraine. So Ukrainians won independence for a couple years during the Russian Revolution. So so this broader Russian war, civil war, had a lot of independent fights for independence, but among them, including a noble anarchist movement that came out of Ukraine. So it was a very interesting time. But I do think, I don't know what will happen to the Russian people or Russia generally. I know Ukraine will fight, whether it has American, Europe support. Ukraine just has it in them to fight because they're the opposite of the Russian culture. Like, Ukrainians glorify their blacklisted, disappeared artists. They call them the executed Renaissance. Ukrainians are extremely good with anytime you kill one of us, we will build libraries of their work. We will produce their plays. Through us, the living, the survivors, their legacy of art, of creativity, of knowledge will survive. So Ukrainians have built this resilient culture that very much lives, like, when you talk about like the power of culture, the power of art, the power of knowledge, like that is what Ukrainians, that is their unifying force that keeps them going as a country. And I think Ukraine itself is a reminder that ideas cannot die. Like ideas like democracy, ideas like a Ukrainian independent spirit just cannot die. Russia's tried to kill it, and it just keeps persisting. And I think that's a lesson for us today here in America, is no matter what they try to do to us, democracy is an idea whose time has come. And we've only had American democracy here since like 50, 60 years, since the civil rights movement, when Jim Crow was finally abolished. And now they're in white rage backlash. They're trying to bring Jim Crow back, and they're doing a damn good job of it. But ultimately, we're going to get through this time that we're in because all of us can rally around one universal truth. No one likes to be stuck under an idiot boss. For an idiot, being stuck under someone who's just, something's wrong with that person, people, especially Americans, tend to bristle. And I think it's that culture, that sort of like anti-authoritarian spirit that we have in our own culture, glorifying our own heroes and anti-heroes throughout our own culture, like the rebels, the people that dared to live and think outside the system. That's who's always moved our American culture forward. And I think that's what's going to get us through these coming years as we face this dangerous crossroads.
Yeah, that's why, I say, and I used Bigfoot as a metaphor for a podcast because, I looked at him and was like, he's a wonderful, myth or reality if you want, but it's like, it's a myth that maybe just wastes time, but these authoritarian myths, they're waging wars, they're, putting people in chains, and that's the difference. I want to roll into and talk about what I call America's echo chamber, how we see this propaganda and all this disinformation that flows, straight from the Kremlin and, right into the United States, right into our social media, and bleeds everywhere. We see it everywhere. So I want to talk to you about that, is like, why does U.S. culture seem so vulnerable to, all these recycled myths that are propagated by the Russians?
Why? I think, well, Anne Applebaum talks about, the Pulitzer Prize winning historian Anne Applebaum talks about in one of her books, I want to say, which book was it? She's written so many on the topic, but either Gulag or The Iron Curtain. She talks about how for generations during the Soviet Union, the academics from the West who could get access to archives and other resources by visiting the Soviet Union had to be true believers in the Soviet experiment, meaning they had to turn a blind eye to the Orwellian hypocrisy of the Soviet Union. And so as a result, if you were an academic who was determined to just hunt down the facts for the facts' sake, you probably wouldn't be let into the Soviet Union. But if you were a cheerleader for the Soviets, they would roll out the red carpet for you. And you would get whatever access you want because they knew that you would tell the rest of the world the story they wanted them to hear. And so as a result, the academics who would come back from Moscow, where they just felt so convinced that this great socialist experiment was working, they would be treated like celebrities back home in academia because they had this exclusive access and they were seen as serious experts on the Soviet Union. And so that really shaped our understanding of Russia, and that established firmly Western universities teaching the Soviet Union through a Moscow lens. And so countries like Ukraine were seen as nagging pains in the ass that were just demanding, playing the victim card and not really given their own agency and seen as little Russia. And this went on for generations, and it still was in effect until I would even say it's still lingering, because these lionized academics would raise an entire new generation of Russian analysts and experts to see this part of the world through a Moscow lens, and the pattern would just repeat. And so that's why you had in February 2022 so many fancy experts in the media, in the think tank world, confidently telling you that Russia was about to pulverize Ukraine and the war would be over. Kiev was gone. And the world was shocked when Ukrainians were like, no, thank you. You don't know us, and we're not doing that. And instead, we're going to give you these amazing memes of a Ukrainian grandma telling a Russian soldier, here, put these sunflowers in your pocket, because at least when you die, sunflowers will grow over your body. So you'll be good for something. And so the world was shocked. The world was like, wait, oh, that's Ukraine. And so the reason why the world was caught off guard, including our own Ivy-educated American experts in the White House who were trying to get Zelensky, extract him from Kiev, the reason why they were shocked, because, again, our whole entire Western understanding of that part of the world was through a Moscow lens. And that's that idea of furthering empire. That's its own form of disinformation.
Yeah, I see it from a historical perspective. I always look, from Napoleon on, when he instituted his continental system, and he was finding out is it's not easy to subjugate a country. And we've seen it through history. Look, the United States thought we could do it in Vietnam, places like this, and it just doesn't work that way. And warfare, everyone thinks of this conflict on a scale of World War II, and it's just not that. I mean, today you couldn't fight World War II. There's just not enough natural resources to produce that much equipment. We're seeing it's, driven to drones and things like that. But there's so many factors. The main one I see is just for nationalism, that's spawned since the Napoleonic Wars, and countries just, they want self-determination. And when a country's determined to be self-determined, they're going to fight. And the Ukrainians, they're sick of it. Ukraine and Poland have always been in the worst positions. They've always been stuck between two monoliths, Germany and Russia. And much to their chagrin, they have great ground for, fighting wars, nice and flat, open fields, you can maneuver. And, I think there was 3 different successions of dividing it up, 3 times through history it was divided up. And I think, they've had enough. And I don't think they're going to cave. People are like, oh, they're going to break. And I'm like, I just don't see it. I think this is going to play out. I just don't see it happening. I really think Ukrainians are going to pull this out. I have a lot of belief in them.
Well, here's to answer one of your earlier questions, like why are Americans susceptible to Putin's disinformation, is an utter lack of history. Kiev is considered the Jerusalem of the Slavs. So there was a influential kingdom in Kiev that had pretty good literacy rates for its time, pretty good laws for women during its time, and it would marry its princes and princesses all over, all across Europe, and so that was all going on when Moscow didn't even exist. So Ukrainians today in modern day Kiev and cities across the country have statues to their earliest founders going back to like the year 1000. And so this is a very, very old civilization that has a very, very old understanding of itself. And they see Moscow as this hanger-on that like a fiery teenager that sprouted up centuries later and tried to grab the best of Ukraine and appropriate the best of Ukraine for itself, and got and started getting hot-headed and getting into all these wars and became an empire, and then subjugated this larger, older, prouder land known as Ukraine. And so so just like in America, we have our own stories depending on how honest with yourself. So I as an American, I see America as built on slavery, built on genocide, and that it's always been authoritarian for non-white people and non-Christian white people, and that's the real establishment of this country. That's only 250 years old, which is nothing.
Nothing. It's a drop in the bucket.
And yeah.
So this is interesting. I want to see if you can help me untangle this, because I was, going through stats and everything, and I saw a bunch of polls where, I follow them from like 2022 up to now, and I saw them all from like anywhere from like low 70% up to 80% of Americans support sanctions against Russia. And I mean, it's hard to balance this because, Trump was playing Putin's lapdog. Now he seems to be flip-flopping again. Like, oh, I'm against them doing this. I mean, it's just, I can't figure it out. It's like, so, what's holding us back from more of a commitment? I mean, I think Biden was, I saw the Biden administration was helping, but it's like now we're doing next to nothing. I mean, what? How do you explain that? It seems like the preponderance of Americans support sanctions against Russia and, help to Ukraine. But I mean, why are we not there? What do you think that is?
Well, as has been widely documented in books, in investigations by the New York Times, the Washington Post, Trump for decades was, he's had like 6 bankruptcies. Trump is a trust fund kid who was given a boatload of an inheritance from his dad. And yes, he made like a glossy brand for himself that fooled a lot of America. I mean, he was in Home Alone 2, which we all grew up watching. But like, he was a corrupt criminal that was ripping people off, 6 bankruptcies. Like, you're not a good businessman if you've had 6 bankruptcies. And so it came to a point where no credible institution would lend to him. And then suddenly he's in bed with the Russians, and they're buying up Trump properties in Florida. They're buying up Trump properties in cash in Trump Tower itself. The FBI in 2015 busted a Russian gambling ring in Trump Tower. His own dad, Fred Trump, made a
So you can't make
fortune.
it up.
It's the dumbest spy thriller. And Fred Trump, the dad, made a fortune off of Russians, post-Soviet citizens who built up Brighton Beach. That's where the family made payload. And then Trump carried on that tradition with like Little Sunny Isles, Florida, that's now nicknamed Little Moscow because there's so much Russian money laundering there, especially of Trump Towers, which have had their own police raids. And I believe there's certainly been like FBI raids in that little corner of Little Moscow in Florida. So, and then it's all of the connections, and there's so many that we've documented on Gaslit Nation. Also, if anyone wants to read a very good deep dive on this, look at Krug Unger's book, House of Trump, House of Putin, and also American Compromise, 2 books that detail all the decades-long dependency that the Trump family has had on easy, dirty Russian money. That is how they get you. It's called golden handcuffs. And the reason why Trump couldn't say anything bad about Putin in the 2016 election was because he was on the hook to Putin and the Russians. His longtime neighbor and friend, Paul Manafort, who lived next to him in Trump Tower, made a fortune as a political consultant to the ridiculous Trump of Ukraine, this guy named Viktor Yanukovych.
Yes,
who,
yes.
Paul Manafort, longtime Republican, worked for Reagan, told Viktor Yanukovych, like a mouth-breathing thug, on how to dress, how to talk, how to present himself, how to talk out of both sides of his mouth. It was so effective, he won. He became president. What does he start to do? Steal and enrich himself and his family. His son, who was a dentist, suddenly becomes one of the richest men in all of Ukraine. And he's stealing money left and right from the state and building himself this Versailles McMansion. And Ukrainians had enough of it that they overthrew him in a popular uprising. And the guy was a coward, and he fled to Russia, where he stayed ever since, waiting for Trump to join him. And one of the first things that Ukrainians did was they peacefully toured his Versailles McMansion, showing the world on their live streams his private zoo, his private luxury car collection, his private casino on a boat, all paid for with stolen taxpayer money. This guy came to power with Republican Paul Manafort's help, and immediately after this revolution, Paul Manafort then dusts himself off and joins Trump, Jared, and Ivanka in managing Donald Trump's campaign for president.
And you know what irks me is that I was so happy when Manafort went to prison. I was like, oh, maybe we're going to fight this. Maybe, there's a light here and people are going to stand up and fight and not take this. Crickets again. There's just no fight. The Democrats don't seem to push it. And, and the Republicans just wait us out. They just wait us out,
The thing is, the money is so good. It is easy money. As a filmmaker, it is so difficult to get projects off the ground in Hollywood if they have to do with Russia and exposing all this. So if we were to write a political thriller about everything that went down and gave it like a Coen Brothers edge, like it's like a political thriller of idiots, right? And it's like the greatest script in the world. We could not get it made in Hollywood today because there's so much laundered Russian money. And to illustrate that point, if you look at Top Gun, the Top Gun sequel that came out a few years ago, historically in Top Gun, the big bad villain is Russia. But in the sequel, they made it some vague, maybe Eastern or Central European country because one of the investors in Top Gun was a Russian oligarch who was most famous for way overpaying to buy one of Trump's properties in Florida.
Andrea, that's so great. I didn't know that about Top Gun. That's amazing. Oh, wow. And it's funny because I used to always make notes of this whenever I was like at the Cannes Film Festival. I mean, like southern France was like overrun by Russian oligarchs. It was overrun, and you'd see, and you could pick. They were so easy to pick out in the crowds for all the film events at Cannes, and it's like, and they were just throwing their money around. I've been seeing it for years. So that's interesting. I didn't know that. That's a great fact. Thanks for that one.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it's so hard to hold these people accountable because so many people who should be on our side are on the take.
Yeah. Oh, completely. I want to jump into our third and final segment. I want to talk about like democratic myths versus strongman myths. So, why do you think these authoritarian myths often outcompete like democratic ones?
Because the brain is hardwired to look for danger. And so we become fixated on the threats. And as a result, we amplify the threats. And by amplifying the threats, we're amplifying their messaging. And these ideas of democracy, of working together, of voting, just seems so boring in comparison.
Yeah, yeah. Because you think about it, which makes me really sad because it makes me excited. But like democratic ideals like equity, solidarity, collective struggle, I mean, I guess they just don't package well. Do you think that's it?
Well, I do want to say there is for those in the resistance who are saying like I can't live this way. I refuse to live in a prison of my mind, of my body, and just be starved to death. Because one of the things they're doing is they're launching economic warfare against us. Elon Musk deliberately bought Twitter and destroyed our town square. That took away real economic power from people who depended on Twitter to find jobs and to put out their portfolios, a lot of artists, freelancers. And then as soon as he gets into the White House, he starts mass purging, taking away people's livelihoods. And now they're continuing this under like Project 2025. And then with the tariffs. So they're launching economic warfare against us. So we are in a constant state of panic and survival mode, not thinking clearly. The future looks bleak and we succumb to despair. We don't know what to do or where to go. If you don't know what to do or where to go, Gaslit Nation has an action guide on our website, gaslitnationpod.com. We
Yes.
lay out all these strategies there. So to get you grounded and centered, because that's one of the biggest weapons against dictatorship is being prepared and refusing to succumb to panic. But what I wanted, sorry, let me try to remember. The other
It's
point I
okay.
really wanted to make was, what did you say though, Dave? Because I really had something I needed to say.
Like how authoritarian myths thrive,
The good
over
news, yes,
yeah,
thank you for
yeah.
that. The good news is when ancient Greece was dominated by the mighty Roman Empire, Greece actually fought back through the power of ideas and eventually would take over the Roman Empire from within to the point where the predominant language of the Roman Empire became Greek. How did the Greeks fight back? Through the power of ideas by showing alternative ways of living, alternative ways of being, and really presenting an alternative vision. So it's not enough to say vote. What will get people excited is to say we need to have a basic universal income. We need to not work 5 days a week, 6 days a week. We need to, and here's the alternative. Our side can get very sexy by presenting the world and how it can be, no matter how radical that vision is. That is how the Greeks ultimately overcame Roman occupation.
Yeah, and also, the the Romans basically absorbed their religion. They just changed the name of the gods, Ares to Mars, so forth. But yeah, it was very successful, and But the one thing I also wanted to touch on too is I think Ukraine's done a good job of messaging. They've sort of reframed it, not just resisting Russia, but defending democracy itself. And I think that's resonated well around the world. I think that's why you see Americans really supporting sanctions against Russia. So I think their messaging's great. And I think Zelensky comes off great. I think he's the perfect guy. He was the right guy at the right time for them. I think he resonates with young people. I think, he's out in front. He's out there like on the front lines. He's flying around the world doing his things. And, and he's not enriching himself. He's literally just trying to save his country from being taken over and, becoming a satellite state of the Russian Empire again. So I think they've done like a wonderful job of messaging that. I think we just have to, progressives, I think we need to learn to craft these stories that will resonate. they rely on fear mongering. That's always been the playbook from, Goebbels on up. That's always been the playbook. But, the other interesting parallel, I have to bring this in too. And I was just thinking like yesterday, and I was just thinking about the Spanish Civil War, and it's kind of reminding me of that in a little bit, because you're seeing like how in the Spanish Civil War we had the Lincoln Brigade, and you're getting all these volunteer fighters, and you're starting to see that, because I've met a bunch because of my friends that are mobile journalists in Ukraine. They've been covering the war since it started, and I keep meeting all kinds of people, like a guy from Portugal who like has a drone unit, and like all these different people. So that makes me feel good. I don't know if you've noticed that, but it felt like a little parallel to the Spanish Civil War. I just hope we have a different outcome.
100%. And then just like the Spanish Civil War, you have the fascists backed by other dictatorships like China and Iran.
Yeah.
So yes, and North Korea. So yes, it very much feels like.
Didn't they just capture some Cubans there too?
Oh, I'm sure.
Did I see that?
I'm sure.
Yeah.
The Russians are running out of bodies for their meat grinder.
Yeah, and the thing with like these strongmen is like, they just love mythology too, like period. It, makes them look larger than life. Meanwhile, on the left, we have enough for like a meme budget, Yeah, that's all we got.
Totally.
These are the myths, it's like universal health care seems to be a myth. But it's a myth I want to believe in.
Our job now is to present an alternative future, because the one thing dictators hate is this idea that there's any alternative to their rule. They are convinced in their minds they're going to be here forever and ever, and that's it.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure, like, as we discussed earlier, I'm pretty sure Putin and Trump think they're going to live forever. And I
Peter
think
Thiel. Like
Peter Thiel, all of them.
He's obsessing over the Antichrist because he's like got this like.
I'm like, where am I? It's like, I can't believe these things you hear. It's like pure lunacy. They're so
struggling
deluded.
with his mortality. Like he's like.
Yeah.
So they're trying to live forever in the damage and the trauma they're causing and the monuments they're building to themselves. But they're not going to. Like, we're going to overcome them. Nightmares will be taught in history books. We're going to have survivors tell their stories for generations, passing them down. So ultimately, the people ultimately prevail because there's something in us. There's something in us that just sees this sheer stupidity and is just outraged by it.
Well, see, I always say, it was like, imagine if the left like leaned into its own myths, though I don't think they're myths, but like say, Sasquatch is a union organizer. Nessie's lobbying for climate justice. I think we just got to lean into them more. And I think we're seeing it, because I believe it's just, I just believe fascism just pushes people, and and I think it's accelerated. Like, I didn't think all this would happen so quickly. The way everything's unrolled in his second presidency, I thought by the early next year, we would be where we're at now. But I'm like, it's, Trump are faster and stupider, I guess.
I knew. I was ready for this. I knew. And I saw it coming. The encounters I had, I on a playground in a swing district in New York State, not in New York City, New York State, I met these two non-white people on the playground with their kids, and they were telling me about Candace Owens uncovering that Kamala Harris was not actually black. And did you know that she's white? And Candace Owens found the dad's birth certificate. And do you know that that you have all of these criminals from Mexico that are destroying Airbnbs? I watched all the videos. And I said to them, well, have you heard of Project 2025? And they're like, no, what's that? I was like, oh, we're done. We're done.
Well, it's like,
that's how I knew the election was lost. That October conversation in 2024.
Yeah, I did too. Like, there were so many things that went wrong with that. I mean, the Democrats, once again, fumbled with that, I believe. But, here it is. But hopefully, I don't know, brighter days. Let's, we have Mamdani in New York. We have one of our guys getting in there, and, it'll be fun to see him beat Cuomo for a second time. I'll enjoy that.
It doesn't happen unless people vote. It doesn't happen
vote,
unless people knock on doors, make phone calls.
Get out there and vote, people.
Yes, the oligarchy is going to throw everything they have against this. They don't want us to have hope. At any time the left has a victory or has hope, the oligarchy has to come in and crush, destroy it, take it from us. That's exactly what started the Spanish Civil War. It was a democratically elected government driven by justice for workers, and the fascists were like, hell no hope for you. We're going to install a brutal dictatorship.
Yep, that lasted for 40 years.
Same with the rise of Hitler. The left was making wins. Union workers were making wins in Austria, and the business elite in Austria and Germany were like, oh, we need a strong man to protect us from the workers, from the unions.
Yeah, well, the little fact about like Hitler, the day he took power, he granted the socialists like May Day holiday. The next day, he abolished the unions. He gave them the holiday and abolished the unions. And it's diluted, like with our film Americon. I would talk to some union people that are voting for Trump. I'm like, are you crazy? Have you read what he wants to do with unions? Do you think he's joking? He's just saying that to get elected? He means it. When a conservative or Republican says something, they mean they're gonna do it. They're not lying about it. Well, I don't want to take up any more of your time, Andrea. I thank you for coming on, and I want everyone to subscribe to Gaslit Nation. It's been one of my favorite podcasts. The day I got invited, I was like, you can ask Sean and all them. I was like, I was like a little schoolgirl. I was like, oh my God, we're going to Gaslit Nation. I was like so excited. So yeah, tune in. I'll have links up to there, and I'll get some links from Andrea for anything that can help us, especially
Benny Johnson. That was the MAGA influencer who was in that DOJ investigation taking hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yes. And Tim Pool.
Yes.
Those are those assholes' names. Yes, I got it.
It came through. Excellent. Well, thank you for coming on, Andrea. You've been great, and I'll keep listening to your podcast. And once again, I can't thank you enough for coming on my new podcast.
Thank you to you and my mom for keeping my show in business.
There's more of us. Bye, Andrea.
Bye. Okay.
So here's the takeaway. Myths are powerful. Dictators weaponize them to divide and control us. Democracies survive when we tell better ones, stories that unite, illuminate, and inspire. Putin's fairy tales are deadly. Trump's conspiracy theories are corrosive. But the myth of Bigfoot? Now that one's harmless. In fact, maybe it's a reminder we can believe in something weird, funny, and even hopeful without it costing lives. Well, if you enjoyed this episode, rate us 5 stars, or at least pretend to, the way billionaires pretend to pay taxes.